Greetings, welcome to Pabanyami. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunodu. I'm going to jump right into it and tell you what the episode is about as we go through it. So, when I was born, there was a white or clear, I should say, film over my eyes, my face, really. And how I know this is because I was told this a little bit later on, by my mother, who obviously, as an eyewitness to my birth, would know these things. And in Jamaica, as other parts of the African world, children who are born with a certain vision, a certain ability to see beyond the normal eye, they usually have this clear film, around their face or eyes, and sometimes their entire body that they're born with. And so I was born to see perhaps more than, ordinary sight. And I remember growing up, in my community of Cassava Peace and thereabout, that, I would see things, as a young boy, at night, daytime, you name it. In fact, I used to be terrified to go to the outhouse because the bathroom was located, much like in the US South and other parts of the world. The bathroom was located outside the house and you had to walk to it. And at night, we were never alone because after 6 p.m. human time is when the other world essentially comes alive, and different kinds of entities and spiritual forces and beings make themselves present and visible, especially those that can see them. So I used to be terrified as a little boy to go to the bathroom at night. Sometimes I used to hold it until the next morning when it was light outside, because 6 a.m. in the morning is a different shift. Essentially things flip to the entities that essentially are stationed for the daytime. And so, growing up, in the yard of my grandfather, whom I loved dearly and still love dearly, I used to hang out with him. I found, as I told you in other episodes, children my age to be boring. They were uninteresting. I found my grandfather fascinating because of what he was into. He was into the tradition in Jamaica that is largely, but not solely, West Central African base, called Kumina, or some people call it Pocominia or Poco for short. So he was very much steeped into that. He had a friend named Nunu, and they used to set up this table once a year, this white table with white cloth, and they had all kinds of food. There were goats that were sacrificed. There was, dancing and everything else. And I was a part of that. In fact, I recall later, much later in life, that I used to go with my grandfather to this, essentially kind of big reunion of other, Poco healers and kind of Kumina spiritualists. Had a big convention that was, further downtown. I used to go with my grandfather to this particular house. That house will become important in my story later. So put a little sticky on that. Nonetheless, these were some of the formative experience, in essentially, revealing rather than shaping, who I was as a, healer born to family healer. To see my family of healers work with the earth. We're sort of earthen, work. So things that are plant-based, things that the soil, those things, water, those things and the powers thereof is what I and they, work with and work through. And so early on, my grandfather would actually teach me about these things. Not he would necessarily tell me he's teaching me, but he would, as he's doing his thing, I would be next to him and I would always follow him and watch him what he did. Once in a while, I may ask him a question, but I would just figure out, because I was a pretty smart child, so I would figure things out as to what was going on. But I remember being very much enthralled by his world, right? In fact, his world became my world. And come to find out that my grandfather was put here on this earth to essentially provide a model and guide me through. Now, as life would happen, no one's life goes from point A to point B in a straight line. If they say that, they're lying. All our lives have twists and turns and detours, off ramps, and some of us, may or may not get back to, the particular path or line that we're on. That said, then, tragedy struck, right? These are the tests. And I want to make sure I earmark them as tests. So what I saw as tragedy was really just a test to reveal, who really I was, sort of bring it out. And so some of you might remember from previous episode, there was a fire, infamous fire that essentially scarred half of my mother's body, killed my baby sister, who was 11 months old. And so she returned back home very early. Now, I saw that as tragedy. I saw that as a loved one leaving me. And again, within, a year or and a half, my sister who passed away, my mother who essentially was scarred and for life, and in certain ways, part of her also went back home shortly thereafter. My closest and most favorite uncle, Uncle Bunny, as we call him in Jamaica, there's lots of bunnies, right? Um, he passed away 7 months after my grandfather passed away, because my grandfather's transition was precisely because my mom took me and my younger brother from Jamaica to New York City, and I should not have left, because my training, so-called, my grooming, so-called, was still underway, and I needed to essentially sit in the oven, of my grandfather's tutelage longer to get what he needed to get to me, to hone my skills, and therefore perhaps leave later if I choose to. But my mom was afraid of what my grandfather did, even though obviously, she was born into it. She interpreted it as something differently, something that she didn't want me to be a part of, not knowing that taking me away was taking me, off that path into another path. And therefore, it's not surprising that my grandfather passed away after leaving Jamaica and going to New York City. He passed away a month later, right? Because his job was unfulfilled, his task was unfulfilled, and so he was, essentially called back home. And 6 months later, 7 months later, excuse me, my uncle, who provided for my mother and I, and so in doing so, my mother was left alone. I was left alone because the people I loved the most, my sister, my grandfather, my uncle, and part of my mother essentially had left. And so I interpreted those tragedies as, they've left me all by myself. What am I going to do? I'm essentially the man of the house. And I remember recently my mother, sharing this with me, you know, and I hope I don't cry on screen, but if it happens, it happens. My mother said to me recently that, throughout the years, I was her husband, because she was never married to my biological father, who was a waste man. And so, she said I was her husband, I was, her father, I was her son. I was all these things to her over the years. And, it really, hit me really hard. Not in the tear ducts, but in the soul. It really hit me hard to have my mother tell me that, oh, I was all of those things to her throughout the years. But in being those things, I wasn't being myself, because my grandfather was no longer there to guide me through, to kind of fully develop me in the way that I was supposed to be developed. And so I essentially began to take on other people's burden. And by taking on their burden, taking on their load, essentially the more I took on, the less I became myself, right? And it sounds familiar to you. If you can relate to this in some way, shape, form, or fashion, it's a story that is not unfamiliar to many of us in terms of how we get taken off of our path, how we get taken off of that particular road by the best and worst that life has to offer. But again, I want to interpret those things properly for you all, to say that what I interpreted as tragedy was really events that were supposed to happen to make me into who I was. And so it was time for my sister to leave. She was to come here, peek out, and say, not my time, not my place. And so she was called back because of circumstances that were there. And so my grandfather was called back. My uncle was called back. And so I had to grow into a man at 10 years old, 11 years old, and kind of walk through the streets of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, being this man. I remember I used to get pantyhose and other things, groceries, for my mom. When I was 10, 11 years old, I remember getting baby formula and food, for my then younger brother, or youngest brother, I should say. And I remember one night, it was dark. In those days, this is probably the late 80s, early 90s. There were no street lamps or street lights out at certain corners. We used to live on Franklin Avenue, Lincoln Place. And so I used to walk several blocks down to the nearest, corner store or bodega to get this baby formula for my youngest brother at the time. And I remember two or three guys, stuck me up at gunpoint. And I said, look, I was cool as ever because, I don't necessarily fear people. And so at 11 years old, I was cool as ever. And I said, look, you can take what you want, and all I saw was baby formula because at that point, we didn't have much money. And so, I had essentially, exact change to get what I needed to get for my mother. And so there was no money for them to take, in frustration, they searched the bags and, searched me and found nothing. And then just, sort of ran off into the night. I went back home and just told my mother nothing about what happened, just gave her the baby formula, just went on with my life. And so, growing up, these experiences were not anything abnormal. It happened quite often. But again, I was being essentially groomed on this other path, that was essentially carved out to essentially reveal things that were already in me. And so I was already a husband. I was already a father when I was 11 years old, right? I was practicing. I was doing the work thereof. And this is what my mom's comment, her heartfelt comment really is saying to me, and also saying to you about when life issues you the best and worst experiences, and you ask, why me? Which I've never asked of myself, but I'm sure many of you have asked that question, which is a reasonable question to ask. It's not a question, why you? Of course it's you. Of course it's about you, right? And why you? Because that's the particular path that is set out for you. And if there is in fact a detour or an off-ramp, it's also set for you to really test you to see, for you to see who you are and what you're made of and what you're about and what you're not about. And so those things really, began to shape me in a number of ways. And therefore, it also shaped the challenge that I was supposed to overcome, which is my ultimate test. And that test revolved around love, right? Which I've shared with you in pieces in other episodes. But I want to try to bring some of these strands together into some cohesive story that, you can follow along and perhaps take something from it that would be of value to you. And so along this path, I began to really study people, right? Watch them closely, study my world. And so Brooklyn was my world. And then other parts of New York City became my world. And as I got a little bit older, turned late 11, maybe 12, tragedy struck again. People who were related to my mother, these are her blood sisters, turned on her. Even her mother, that is my grandmother, was probably unknowingly, I'm not sure, knowingly, unknowingly, an accomplice in calling child services on my mother. And so my brother and I, brothers, I should say, and I, were taken away from my mother. My mother was sent to a mental institution, Bellevue Hospital, to be diagnosed. And of course, her life was never the same. From that point onward, we were separated. And immediately that night turned into months, turned into years. And in that separation, I remember the first time we were brought into an office in Manhattan. And we slept in the office for about a week and a half. And then we were placed into a group home in Queens. We were there for maybe about a few weeks. And then we went to the Bronx. We were in like an apartment complex. I remember it clearly. It was next to a railroad. There was above ground railroad tracks, that I would, as soon as you walk outside, it was right above the apartment complex where, this group home was. And we stayed there maybe about a few days. And then finally we were brought into Syosset, Long Island. And in Syosset, there's a group home referred to as St. Mary's Children and Family Services. And that's where we stayed for up to a year, maybe a little bit more. And so, these are the experiences that we had. And in that group home, we experienced, and I say we, it was my younger brother and I. And so we were separated, meaning it was only me, my younger brother O. We were together at St. Mary's and the other places we went through. But my youngest brother, who was a baby, he was sent into the foster care system right away, up for adoption. And he was eventually adopted by this elderly woman before eventually, being readopted by the same aunt who made the calls to family services and the police to take, us away from my mother and send my mother to an institution. And so while in the group home, I've seen it all. I've seen rapes, I've seen fights, I've seen, corrupt counselors. I've seen, all kinds of things that you can and would imagine, right? That some of you may think is surreal. But I kept it together. I made sure that I looked out for my younger brother and stayed close because we were in the same cabin, and I made sure of that. And I remember going to the office almost every day asking, did my mother call? Is my mother coming? And I know they were getting annoyed at me. These were these white folks who ran this facility. Some of the counselors, were of my complexion, but, mostly the white folks ran the institution. They ran the kitchen. They were mostly the teachers, the counselors, and the other staff members that were around. Again, there were like maybe 3 or 4 people that were, one of the a few of the counselors, excuse me. And so I left. I went AWOL. I essentially escaped from there, without my brother Omar. I just left because I wanted to find my mother. And so I took the LIRR train and went back to Brooklyn. I remember how to get back to the apartment, rang the doorbell, and there was my mother. But by then it wasn't my mother because she had been so inundated with drugs and all kinds of, I don't know what they put in her, but that wasn't my mother. Yes, it was my mother's body, but that wasn't my mother's soul, right? That wasn't my mother's spirit, as she had that glazed look over her face. I remember asking her, why didn't she come for me? Why didn't she come for us, right? I don't remember her response, if she had a response at all, but I remember that, right? And then a few days later, a white woman knocked at the door, and she was a caseworker, a social worker. And she said that I had to go back to the foster care. I had to go back to the group home. And so they took me away again. And then we spent some more months in the same place. And then my aunt, the same aunt that put us in that situation, who, by the way, also had worked so-called witchcraft against my mother because of whatever act she had to grind against my grandfather, adopted, or tried to adopt us. It brought us into her home. I refused for her to adopt me and my brother. And that set up this sort of, tension between the two of us. So we moved into the aunt's house, and then of course things didn't, work out too well there. And eventually, I, take myself through school, applied to college and got in, and immediately, there was a sort of an argument between that aunt and mine. Again, several arguments, but that one I said I'm leaving. I left, went to the other aunt's house, and eventually got my apartment. And then, the rest is sort of living on my own, which I lived on my own for the most part. And I'm going to pause the story there and focus on the takeaways and lessons because I want to keep this segment to 20 minutes. And so, the takeaways there is this: all along throughout everything, what we may call the creator, the supreme being, whatever you want to call, this big spirit, right? I call it Father God because in my experience, it's been like a father to me. And the mistake we often make as human beings is that we use the human physical world to judge and make sense of the immaterial spiritual world, which is backwards. It's like using the ocean to judge the water in your tub. Yes, it's both water, but there's different scale and magnitude. It's like using a globe, to judge the earth. Yes, it's a model of it, but it's not nowhere close to what the other is. And so, my name back home is the name that I have here. How I look back home and how I really look is not how I look here. And so I refer to it as Father God, this great spirit, but I've seen him. He looks like me, right? I've seen him both in the dream state, and I've seen him both, in flesh as you and I, when he's taken on human form. And so, and I've talked to him, it's like I'm talking to you. And so no one can tell me anything but this. And again, this is my experience, right? I'm sure it's true for a lot of people who may not have the vocabulary or the courage to say so, but I have both, which is that, Father God, as I call this great spirit, right? Because he's like a father to me, right? And you may have a different relationship, with this great spirit. Has always been there with me, right? I've been through too much by myself, knowing that I was never by myself. Whenever I saw, whenever I was broken, I was often broke, didn't have much, and I would look down and I would see money on the floor. I know that was my father looking out for me. I don't mean my earthly father, not that idiot. I mean my spiritual father, right? I mean God, Father God. And people may say, well, Gracie, you have changed. I haven't changed. You just don't know who I am, and I know who I am. You see, we can walk the same road. We have to make our own footsteps, which means we have our own individuated steps we make along the same road, if it is the same road we're supposed to travel. So your path is not my path, and my path is not your path. And that's something we have to get very much clear about. And so when people want to judge and they want to compare and they want to look at their lives and see, why am I not like him? Why is he like that? How does he do this? Why does he have that? Comparisons, is the enemy of the true self. And so, what I know in my experience, and I know God for myself, because I've not only seen him, in person, in the flesh, like you seeing me. I've also seen him in the dream state when my spirit travels, and he looks just like me, right? And so don't be fooled by, the okie doke, the iconographies that are out there. And so knowing God, for myself, and knowing that he's always been there with me, that this supreme being, the celestial father, has been there with me. He was there with me the whole time, and I knew it. I felt it. I knew it. That's why I never feared. That's why I don't fear people. That's why I don't worry about people. That's why I don't worry about the judgments of people. I don't worry about ex-spouses. I don't worry about ex-girlfriends. I don't worry about ex-friends. I don't worry about whatever they have to say, because none of that makes sense to me. Only my Father, right? My Father God can judge me, and he doesn't judge me, right? Yes, sometimes he'll correct me, and sometimes it may be blunt, but that's what a father's supposed to do. Be honest with his child, right? And so throughout all those experiences, right, the robberies, and there are many on the trains and the streets, the attempted robberies, I never fear. I was never shook, right? Never scared. When those bullies jumped me, all 5 of them, and I fought back, and that was the first and last time it ever happened, because no matter what my stature was, my soul was always, big and large, right? And so that's why my enemies can't defeat me and they can't destroy me, right? You know how many airplanes have gone down with me? You know how many cars are sort of out of control, where I wasn't tired and I fell asleep at the wheel on the New Jersey Turnpike, and I swerved through 3 cars. When I opened my eyes and swerved through 3 cars, that was my Father God. You know how many times my enemies send, malignant, or negative, evil spirits after me? And they can't see me because, I'm in disguise, because my Father has put me in disguise. You'll have no idea the things that I've been through, right? And you don't really need to, because I share them to you as simply signposts to say that, all along, my Father's been there with me. And this same great spirit is there with you, whether you realize it, recognize it or not. Now, I'm not here to convert anyone. I'm not a missionary. And so these experiences, are set out to share with you, as the same way that, for instance, the Yoruba Ifa systems work, where these stories, which in Cuba they call pataki, these stories about the orishas, right, are meant to serve as guides for human behavior, for conduct, for decision making. My story is set the same way, as sort of a testimonial to share, that may offer you something that which you can take that be of value to you in terms of your own life, and getting you on your own straight and narrow, and on your path and on your way. Baba Nyami, I've been your guide and host. Kindly drop your questions, common experiences in the section below. Till next time, stay well.